They criticized Gabriel Henderson when he decided to adopt three black boys. People thought he would regret it later, but many years later, those same people were on their knees asking for forgiveness. What made them feel so desperate? Before we start the story, please leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from today. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Gabriel Henderson held the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his hands rough and strong. He drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Grove, his small town. The late afternoon sun made long shadows on the road, just like the worries in Gabriel's mind. But Gabriel was not someone who let his worries stop him, especially now when three young boys needed him. Gabriel glanced at a manila envelope on the seat next to him. Inside it were adoption papers for three brothers, Eli, Aiden, and Zachary. Just 2 months ago, the boys' parents had died in a terrible car accident. Gabriel, who was working on fixing their house back then, had become friends with the family, especially with the boys who would watch him work with big, curious eyes. Gabriel remembered seeing them at their parents' funeral. They looked so sad and lost. Eli, the oldest at 10, tried to be strong for his younger brothers. Aiden, who was usually so full of energy, stood quietly, looking very lost, and Zachary, the youngest at 7, cried softly into Eli's sleeve. What would Melinda think? Gabriel whispered to himself. He thought about his late wife, who had passed away. Gabriel and Melinda had always wanted children, but they never had any. Now, at 52 years old, Gabriel was about to become a dad to these three boys who needed someone to care for them. As he passed Mrs. Hawkins's house, Gabriel noticed her peeking out from behind her curtains. He knew what people in town were saying. He'd heard whispers at the hardware store and saw people raising their eyebrows at church. A single man like Gabriel, adopting three young black boys, was not something people saw often in their small town. But Gabriel didn't care about what was usual or unusual. He cared about doing the right thing, about giving love and a safe home to these boys. Gabriel remembered the last meeting with the social worker. He recalled Eli's hopeful voice when he asked, "You really want all of us together?" Gabriel could hear the surprise and hope in Eli's voice, and it almost made him cry. Gabriel had never even thought of splitting up the brothers. As Gabriel pulled up to a red light, he closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that taking care of the boys would be tough. They were all still grieving. They'd have to adjust to living together, and they'd face people who didn't understand them. But Gabriel was ready to face these challenges. He whispered to himself, "We'll figure it out together." That's what family did, after all. The light turned green, and Gabriel drove toward the future he had chosen, a future they would build together, day by day. After a few days, Gabriel pulled up to his modest 2-story house, the place he'd called home for 20 years. The white paint on the house was chipped in places, and the porch could use some fresh stain, but it was a sturdy and cozy home, just like Gabriel. The three brothers sat close together in the back seat, their small backpacks held tightly in their laps. "Well, boys," Gabriel said gently as he turned off the engine, "we're home." The word home seemed to hang in the air, full of meaning. Aiden, the middle brother, looked around and said softly, "It's big." Gabriel led them up the path to the front door, noticing how they stuck close together with Zachary holding onto Eli's sleeve. Gabriel unlocked the door, and it swung open to show the cozy living room. "Come on in," Gabriel encouraged, stepping aside. "This is your house now, too." The boys walked in slowly, taking in the worn but comfortable couch, the wooden coffee table Gabriel had built himself, and a few family photos on the wall. Their shoes barely made a sound on the floor. "Would you like to see your rooms?" Gabriel asked. He could see their eyes light up with surprise. "Our rooms?" Eli whispered, almost like he didn't believe it. Gabriel nodded and led them up the stairs. "I've got 3 bedrooms up here. They're not fancy, but they're yours. You can decorate them however you like." He showed each of them their rooms, painted in soft colors, with simple beds, dressers, and desks. Zachary's little hand traced the edge of his bed. Eli seemed interested in the desk, and Aidan stood uncertainly in the doorway of his room, looking nervous. Gabriel knelt down to their level, feeling his knees creak. "Listen, boys," he said, making sure to look each of them in the eyes. "I know this is all new and maybe a little scary, but I want you to understand something important." He paused, making sure they were paying attention. "This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'm going to be here for you. Always." Zachary's lower lip trembled. "Promise?" Gabriel's heart ached as he said firmly, "I promise. We're a family now, and families stick together." Eli smiled a little, and Aidan's shoulders relaxed. Zachary, feeling a burst of bravery, stepped forward and hugged Gabriel around the neck. Gabriel hugged him back gently and opened his arms for Eli and, finally, for Aidan. They all came together in a family hug for the first time. Gabriel could feel their small smiles on his shoulder, gentle but full of hope, like the first rays of sunshine after a long, dark night. News traveled fast in their small town of Pine Grove. By the time Gabriel took the boys to the grocery store that weekend, people were already whispering. Some older women held their purses tightly, and some parents moved their kids away as Gabriel and the boys passed by. Mrs. Ellis, an older lady with perfectly styled gray hair, was standing at the checkout. When she saw Gabriel helping Zachary pick out a box of cereal, she pursed her lips and turned to Mrs. Campbell, the grocery bagger. "Did you hear about Gabriel Henderson?" Mrs. Ellis said loudly. "He went and took in those 3 boys without asking anyone. It's just not right." Gabriel pretended not to hear and guided his sons to the dairy section, but he noticed that Aidan's shoulders tensed at her words. Mrs. Ellis went on even louder. "A single man raising 3 children. He has no experience with kids, and those boys—" She didn't finish her sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. Some people nodded in agreement, and soon more people were whispering. At church the next Sunday, Mrs. Ellis sat with her friends, stirring her iced tea and saying, "It's not natural. Those boys need a mother's touch and guidance from someone who understands their background." Her words were full of disapproval. Rumors spread through town. At the hardware store, where Gabriel usually bought supplies, the owner suddenly claimed he was out of stock of things Gabriel needed. At the local diner, their usual booth was mysteriously reserved when they stopped in for breakfast. Mrs. Ellis made sure to complain about Gabriel at every town meeting, saying, "I'm worried about the influence on our community." As Gabriel and the boys walked around town, people who once greeted Gabriel warmly now crossed to the other side of the street. Parents told their kids not to play with Eli, Aidan, and Zachary, leaving the brothers alone at the playground. Even though Gabriel could feel the heavy weight of people's judgment, he kept his head high and stayed focused on his sons. One day at the grocery store, Gabriel was teaching Zachary how to pick ripe tomatoes. "See how this one gives a little when you press it?" He showed him, his rough hands gentle on the fruit. "That means it's ready to eat." Zachary nodded, copying Gabriel's movement. Up ahead, Eli and Aidan were picking out apples like Gabriel had taught them. Suddenly, Gabriel heard a familiar voice. "Well, if it isn't Gabriel Henderson." Gabriel looked up to see Bill Cooper, the hardware store owner. Bill was wearing his usual flannel shirt with his arms crossed over his chest. "Hey, Bill," Gabriel replied, trying to be friendly, but he noticed a strange look in Bill's eyes. Bill looked at the boys, smirking a little. "So the rumors are true," Bill said. "You've gone and taken in some city kids." He said, "city kids," in a way that made Gabriel's jaw clench. "These are my sons, Bill," Gabriel said firmly, putting a hand on Zachary's shoulder. He could feel the boy trembling a little. Bill let out a rough laugh. "Sons, come on, Gabriel. You really think you can raise 3 boys from the city? You don't know the first thing about them." Gabriel and his 3 boys, Eli, Aidan, and Zachary, were doing the weekly grocery shopping. This was still a new experience for them, learning to do things as a family. Gabriel loved his sons deeply, though they were only just starting to adjust to life together. Gabriel knew his boys had faced hard times before he became their dad, so he wanted to do everything he could to show them that he cared. As they were picking out apples, Gabriel noticed his friend Bill approaching. He'd known Bill for over 20 years, so he was surprised by the look Bill gave him, a mixture of pity and disapproval. The way Bill said background made Gabriel's stomach turn. Eli and Aiden stopped picking apples and looked up, watching the exchange. Their faces were blank, but their eyes showed hurt. Bill seemed to think Gabriel wasn't prepared to be a father to these boys. "I know about being a father," Gabriel replied, keeping his voice steady, "and that's what matters." Bill only shook his head. "These aren't exactly the kind of kids you're used to, Gabriel. They need a different kind of discipline, if you know what I mean." Gabriel felt heat rise up his neck, but he forced himself to stay calm. He noticed other shoppers slowing down, pretending to look at fruits and vegetables while they eavesdropped. Gabriel answered, "I appreciate your concern, Bill, but my boys and I need to finish our shopping." He then turned to Zachary, who was clutching a tomato so tightly it might burst, and gently said, "Let's go pick out some potatoes, buddy." As they walked away, Bill called after them, "Don't say nobody warned you, Gabriel. Some things just aren't meant to be." Gabriel's hands gripped the cart so tightly his knuckles turned white. The boys followed quietly, their excitement for grocery shopping completely gone. Bill's harsh words lingered in the air, making the simple act of buying food feel like walking through a minefield. Looking at his son's sad faces, Gabriel realized this was only the beginning. If an old friend of his was going to treat them this way, what else might they face? The next weekend, Gabriel decided he wanted to spend time with each of the boys one-on-one. He hoped this would help him understand their unique personalities better. Gabriel wanted them to feel safe enough to open up to him. He found Eli, the quietest of the three, sitting in the living room, studying the wooden coffee table with a focused look. The boy's fingers traced the lines in the wood. Gabriel quietly sat down beside him and said, "I made that table myself about 5 years ago." Eli's eyes widened, surprised. "You made this?" Gabriel nodded, smiling. "Yes. I've been working with wood most of my life. My daddy taught me when I was about your age." Eli hesitated for a moment before asking, in a barely audible voice, "Could you teach me?" Warmth blossomed in Gabriel's chest. "Of course I can," he replied. Gabriel led Eli to the workshop in the garage where he had all his tools and wood supplies. Eli's eyes lit up at the sight of the tools on the wall and the workbench covered in wood shavings. Gabriel set up 2 stools and showed Eli a small piece of pine wood. "This here is the kind of wood I started with," Gabriel said, running his hand over the smooth surface. "It's simple and forgiving, perfect for learning." Eli, usually so quiet, started asking questions about each tool. Gabriel patiently explained, feeling his smile widen with each question. It was like a little light was flickering on inside Eli, each answer adding to his curiosity. "What's the hardest thing you've ever made?" Eli asked, carefully holding a piece of sandpaper as if it were made of gold. Gabriel chuckled, remembering the many long nights he spent working on his favorite piece. "Probably the rocking chair in the living room. It took me 3 tries to get the curves just right," he replied. Gabriel noticed a change in Eli's expression, a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. "Maybe tomorrow we could start with something small," Eli suggested shyly, "like a birdhouse?" Gabriel nodded, feeling a strong sense of hope. "A birdhouse sounds perfect." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the gentle clinking of tools. Gabriel realized that this might be more than a hobby for them. It could be a bridge between him and his son, a way to help Eli feel safe and express himself. Gabriel felt a warmth of hope that maybe, with time, each boy would find his own way to open up. On Saturday, Gabriel and his boys went to the annual Riverside Town Fair. The fair was bustling with activity, with booths selling cotton candy, corn dogs, and funnel cakes. The delicious smells filled the air, and the boys were excited. Zachary pointed to a ring toss booth where stuffed animals were lined up as prizes. "Can we try the ring toss?" he asked quietly. Gabriel smiled and led them over to the booth. He bought 3 sets of rings, and the boys took turns tossing them, laughing and cheering each other on. Aiden even managed to win a small teddy bear. Seeing his boys smile made Gabriel's heart swell with happiness. But the moment was interrupted by a sharp voice. "Well, look who decided to grace us with their presence," said Thomas Baker, their next-door neighbor. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at Gabriel with an unfriendly expression. Gabriel placed a protective hand on Zachary's shoulder and greeted Thomas calmly. "Afternoon, Thomas?" Thomas ignored Gabriel's greeting and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some of us have lived here our whole lives, building this community on good, traditional values." He gestured dismissively at Gabriel's boys and sneered, "And here you are, making a mockery of everything we stand for." Gabriel noticed his son's reactions. Aiden looked angry, Eli went pale, and little Zachary pressed closer to Gabriel, scared. A crowd had started to gather, whispering and watching the scene. Gabriel took a deep breath, his anger bubbling inside, but he kept his voice calm. "These boys are my family now, Thomas," he said firmly, "and family is the strongest value I know." Thomas scoffed and replied, "Family? You're just trying to show off how progressive you are. You're ruining this town's values, Gabriel, making us all look bad." Gabriel saw tears forming in Zachary's eyes, and he could tell the other 2 boys were hurting too. They looked up at him, waiting to see how he'd respond. Squaring his shoulders, Gabriel met Thomas's gaze and said, "The only value being ruined here is kindness, Thomas, and that's not coming from me or my boys." Turning to his sons, he said, "Come on, boys, let's go get some ice cream. I believe I promised each of you 2 scoops." As they walked away, Gabriel felt the weight of people's stares on their backs. He knew people were whispering, but he held his head high. Eli tugged on Gabriel's sleeve and asked quietly, "Did you mean what you said? About us being your family?" Gabriel stopped, turned to face his boys, and knelt down so he was at their level. "Every word," he replied, "and do you ever forget it." That evening, after a quiet dinner, Gabriel and his boys sat together in their small living room. The warm light from a table lamp cast gentle shadows, and the old grandfather clock ticked softly in the background. Gabriel knew they needed to talk about what happened at the fair. Aiden looked down and asked in a sad voice, "Why don't they want us here?" Gabriel's heart ached at his son's pain. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together and speaking gently. "Some people don't understand that families can look different. They're scared of things that aren't like their own." Eli looked down and said quietly, "Maybe it would be easier if you had normal kids, white kids." Gabriel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He moved closer to his boys, looking each one in the eye. "Look at me," he said. "You are exactly the kids I want. You're my sons, and nothing anyone says will ever change that." Zachary's lower lip trembled, and he said, "But Mr. Baker said—" Gabriel interrupted him gently. "Mr. Baker is wrong, dead wrong. You belong here with me. This is your home." Aiden looked worried and asked, "What if they never accept us?" Gabriel put his hand on Aiden's shoulder. "Then that's their loss," he replied. "They'll miss out on knowing 3 amazing young men. What matters is us, our family." Tears spilled down Zachary's cheeks, and Gabriel opened his arms. The boys rushed into his embrace, and he held them close as they cried, letting out the hurt they'd been holding inside. Gabriel's own eyes filled with tears, but he whispered, "I love you boys, and I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." Later, after the boys had gone to bed, Gabriel sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a cold cup of coffee. His hands trembled slightly as he thought about the hurt in his son's eyes and the hateful words they'd heard. He worried about how much of an impact these encounters might have on them. Would they always feel like outsiders? Would they believe the mean things people said? Gabriel knew he needed to protect their hearts, to teach them to be strong and proud, even when others didn't understand them. The next morning, Gabriel was up early, filling out 3 registration forms as his sons ate breakfast. "How would you boys feel about joining some sports teams?" he asked, his voice light but hopeful. He turned to Eli and said, "You could play basketball like you've been talking about." To Aiden, he added, "Didn't you play baseball at your old school?" And to Zachary, he said, "What about soccer? You've been kicking that ball around the yard like a pro." Their faces lit up with excitement. Zachary nearly spilled his milk in his enthusiasm. "Really? We can play?" One Saturday, Gabriel drove his 3 boys, Eli, Aiden, and Zachary, to the community center. They were so excited. It was the day to sign up for sports and get fitted for their team uniforms. The gym was full of people, parents filling out forms, kids trying on jerseys, and coaches getting everything ready. But as soon as they walked in, they noticed people were looking at them strangely. Eli was the first to feel it. He looked around and his shoulders slumped. Gabriel saw it too. Out of all the kids in the gym, Eli, Aiden, and Zachary were the only black children there. Aiden moved closer to Gabriel, and Zachary held on to Eli's hand. All the excitement they had felt in the car ride suddenly disappeared. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Aiden whispered, looking down at the floor. Gabriel knelt down so he could look his boys in the eyes. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. You have every right to be here and play, just like every other kid." "But everyone's staring," Zachary whispered, feeling uncomfortable. Gabriel put his arm around him and said, "Then let them stare. You boys focus on having fun and playing the sports you love. I'll be at every game, cheering you on." The boys nodded, but Gabriel could see they still felt unsure. As they went through the sign-up stations, they huddled together and spoke in whispers. Their happy energy had turned into nervous glances. When they got to the uniform station, the volunteer handed out jerseys without looking at them very much. Gabriel noticed his sons walk into the changing room slower than before. They came back out wearing their new uniforms. Eli had green for basketball, Aiden had white for baseball, and Zachary had blue for soccer. Gabriel expected them to be smiling proudly, but instead, they looked unsure. He tried to cheer them up. "You look great, boys. Those uniforms fit perfectly." But he could see how they kept pulling at the fabric, looking around at the other kids. What should have been a joyful moment had instead become a reminder that they were different, another challenge in their new life. The next day, Gabriel found Eli in the garage, looking curiously at his old tools on the workbench. Eli's eyes sparkled as he touched each tool, his face lighting up with interest. Gabriel felt happy seeing his son like this. "Would you like to learn more about tools and building things?" he asked. "We could make a little workshop here just for you." "Really?" Eli asked, his eyes wide. "Of course," Gabriel smiled. "We'll clear this space and get you some tools of your own. I'll teach you everything I know." That afternoon, they cleaned the garage, organizing tools and talking about what they would build. Gabriel even showed Eli his old woodworking magazines, and they picked out projects they could work on together. "Can we build a tree house?" Eli asked, pointing to a picture in one of the magazines. Gabriel looked at the picture and nodded. "A treehouse is a big project, but if you're willing to learn, we can work up to it. Let's start with something smaller." The next weekend, Gabriel took Eli to the hardware store. They walked down the aisles, picking out tools and supplies. Some people stared, but Gabriel stood close to Eli to protect him from their looks. At the lumber section, Eli proudly held up a board, saying, This one has fewer knots, just like you taught me. Gabriel smiled and ruffled his hair. Good eye, buddy. That's exactly what we need. Back at home, they set up Eli's workspace together. Gabriel handed him a tool belt saying, "These are yours now. But remember our safety rules, okay?" Eli nodded seriously, buckling the belt around his waist like it was the most important thing ever. They started by building a birdhouse. Gabriel helped Eli measure and saw the wood. Eli's face was focused, his tongue sticking out as he tried to cut straight lines. Gabriel watched, his heart full of pride. "You're a natural," he said. "Just like you?" Eli asked, his eyes full of hope. Gabriel felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Yeah, buddy, just like me." As they worked, they talked about building things, and Eli shared memories of his birth parents. In that garage, with the smell of wood and sawdust around them, Gabriel felt his connection with Eli growing stronger. It felt like nothing else in the world mattered. The next morning, Gabriel woke up early, planning to get a head start on the birdhouse project. But when he went outside, he stopped in shock. Black paint had been smeared across the white garage door, spelling out mean and hateful words. Gabriel felt his stomach twist. He couldn't believe people could be so cruel. He clenched his fists and felt his face get hot with anger. He thought about Eli and his brothers seeing this, and he knew he had to do something before they woke up. Without hesitating, Gabriel grabbed some spare paint and a roller from his truck. His hands shook, but he worked quickly, painting over the ugly words before the boys woke up. As he painted, he thought about all the people in town, the same people who'd smiled at him in the store, the people he'd helped build houses for. It was hard to understand how anyone could do this, but Gabriel knew he had to stay strong. He finished painting, making sure there was no trace of those hateful words. He put away his supplies just in time. The garage door looked clean and new, but Gabriel knew what was hiding beneath that fresh coat of paint. It was like a heavy weight on his heart. He took deep breaths, trying to calm himself down. The boys needed him to be strong, not angry. He walked back into the house and started making breakfast, hoping that maybe, just maybe, his family would still find acceptance in this town. That afternoon, Gabriel took his boys to the community center to sign up for the town's cleanup day. He wrote all their names down on the volunteer list. On the day of the cleanup, they arrived early, with gloves ready. Other people looked at them and whispered, but Gabriel ignored them. "We're here to help," he said, looking at Mrs. Ellis, who seemed surprised, but handed them their assignments. They spent the morning picking up trash on Main Street. Gabriel felt proud as he watched Eli help an elderly woman gather scattered newspapers, while Aiden and Zachary worked together to clean up the playground. Even Mr. Campbell from the hardware store, who had seemed unfriendly before, said, "Those boys of yours sure know how to work." It was the first kind word Gabriel had heard in weeks, and it made him feel a little lighter. The following weekend, they volunteered at the library's book drive. Zachary loved helping organize the children's section, arranging the books just right. Bit by bit, Gabriel hoped his family could find their place here, showing others who they really were. Through every challenge, Gabriel knew he would stand by his boys, helping them find joy and acceptance in the life they were building together. Mrs. Willow, the librarian, was a quiet lady who didn't usually smile. But when she watched Aiden helping Gabriel organize picture books at the library, she found herself smiling. "He has a good eye for detail," she told Gabriel softly. "We could use his help more often at the food bank." Aiden was making everyone happy with his big laugh and cheerful jokes. Even the grumpy people smiled when he was around. Every week, Gabriel and the boys went wherever people needed help. They painted fences at the school, set up chairs at the senior center for bingo night, and planted flowers in the town square. Over time, things started to change. People stopped whispering behind Gabriel's back, and some even nodded and smiled. One day, Eli helped fix a broken shelf at the community center. He used the carpentry skills Gabriel taught him, and several people praised his work. "You have a wonderful family," said Mr. Baker, a man who used to keep his distance. He watched as the boys carried boxes of donations into the church. Those kids, they're good kids. Gabriel felt a warm feeling in his chest. "Yes, they are," he replied with pride. One evening, Gabriel noticed that Mrs. Hawkins's fence was falling over. Mrs. Hawkins was an elderly lady who had been living alone since her husband passed away, and her fence was very old. "Boys," Gabriel said the next morning as he gathered his tools, "we're going to help a neighbor today." When they arrived at Mrs. Hawkins's house, she peeked out the window, looking suspicious. Gabriel knocked on her door. "Your fence needs fixing. I'd like to help if you'll let me." Mrs. Hawkins opened the door slowly. "I can't afford repairs right now, Gabriel." "No charge," Gabriel replied with a smile. "It's what neighbors do." Gabriel showed Eli how to measure and cut the wood, while Aiden and Zachary removed the broken boards. Mrs. Hawkins watched them from her porch, looking less suspicious by the minute. At lunchtime, she surprised them by bringing out a plate of cookies and lemonade. "You boys must be thirsty," she said with a warmer smile. Zachary took a cookie and said, "Thank you, ma'am." As the afternoon passed, Mrs. Hawkins started to ask the boys about their school and what they liked to do. When Eli told her that Gabriel was teaching him carpentry, her eyes brightened. "My husband was a carpenter too," she said. "He would have liked seeing such good work." When they finished, the fence stood tall and strong. Mrs. Hawkins walked along the fence, nodding happily. "You boys did a wonderful job," she said. "You must make your father proud." The boys looked at Gabriel, surprised, and back at Mrs. Hawkins with small smiles. Later, as they sat around the dinner table, Zachary spoke up. "Dad, did you hear? Mrs. Hawkins called you our father." Aiden grinned. "She actually smiled at us," he said. "It felt good," Eli added quietly. Gabriel looked at his sons, his heart full. He could see how happy they were to be noticed as part of a real family. Helping Mrs. Hawkins gave Gabriel an idea. He noticed that the benches in Memorial Park were old, though with peeling paint and rough wood. "How about we fix those benches next?" he suggested. The boys agreed, though they looked a little nervous about doing it in public. Gabriel loaded his truck with sandpaper, paint, and brushes, and they headed to the park. As they worked on the first bench, Gabriel showed them how to smooth out the rough spots with sandpaper. Eli did it naturally, and Aiden and Zachary raced to see who could strip the paint off the fastest. "Am I doing it right, Dad?" Aiden asked, showing Gabriel his work. "Perfect," Gabriel replied, feeling warm inside as he heard Aiden call him Dad. A little girl who was playing nearby came up to watch. "What are you doing?" she asked, curious. Zachary, who was usually shy, surprised Gabriel by answering, "We're making the bench pretty again. Want to see?" The girl nodded, and Zachary showed her how to sand the wood gently. Soon, other kids came over to watch, and then their parents joined in too. "Can I help?" one boy asked, and Gabriel ended up giving an impromptu painting lesson to a small group of children. Eli patiently showed a younger child how to hold the brush, while Aiden and Zachary joked about the paint that was splattered on their clothes. "You're really good at this," one of the kids told Eli. Eli smiled and said, "Our dad taught us." When they finished the last bench, several parents thanked them. One mother said, "These benches haven't looked this good in years. You should be proud." On the way home, Gabriel noticed the boys seemed more confident. They talked excitedly about the kids they had met and what project they could do next. "Can we fix more things around town?" Aiden asked. "Yeah," Zachary agreed. "Those kids were nice. Maybe they'll help again." Gabriel looked in the rearview mirror at his sons, feeling proud. They were becoming known in the community for their kind hearts and helpful hands. The first day of school arrived, and Gabriel helped the boys pack their backpacks. He saw that Aiden, who was 12, looked nervous and kept adjusting his new shirt. "Remember what I said," Gabriel told them. "You're Hendersons. Hold your heads high. But by the third day, Gabriel noticed that Aiden was quieter than usual at dinner. When Gabriel asked him about school, Aiden just mumbled, "It's fine." Later, Eli told Gabriel that some kids at school were being mean to Aiden. They teased him and even pushed him, and no one helped him. Gabriel felt his heart ache. That night, he heard Aiden crying in his room. When Gabriel went in, Aiden looked up, wiping his tears. "I tried to be strong," he whispered. "I didn't want to cause trouble." Gabriel sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not causing trouble, son. They are, and we're going to fix this." The next day, Gabriel went straight to the principal's office. When the principal tried to brush it off, saying, "Boys will be boys," Gabriel looked him straight in the eye. "No, my son doesn't need to toughen up. He needs to be treated with respect, just like everyone else." Finally, the principal agreed to talk to the students and teachers involved. That afternoon, Aiden looked relieved as he told Gabriel about an assembly where the principal spoke about bullying and moved some kids away from him. Gabriel felt proud as he replied, "Nobody messes with my boys." That night, while Gabriel was making dinner, Aiden hugged him and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." Gabriel's heart filled with love as he pulled all his boys into a group hug. He could feel their trust growing stronger. The next morning, Gabriel was busy making sandwiches and snacks. He had invited the neighbors over for a little gathering, hoping to help the boys feel even more welcomed. "What if nobody comes?" Zachary asked as he helped Gabriel arrange cookies on a plate. "Then we'll have a feast ourselves," Gabriel said, smiling. At 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hawkins stood on the porch with a homemade apple pie. "I thought we could use something sweet," she said with a warm smile, giving each boy a kind look. Soon, the Zacharias family arrived with their 2 children. Mr. Zacharias, who had always kept his distance, smiled as he stepped inside. Gabriel waved to his neighbors from across the street, smiling. His kids were looking at the basketball hoop in their driveway, so he called out to his son, Eli. "Why don't you show them your jump shot, Eli?" Gabriel said. Eli felt a little shy but nodded and led the Zacharias kids outside to play basketball. Inside the house, Mrs. Hawkins was talking with Gabriel's other son, Aiden, about his favorite school subjects. Meanwhile, Gabriel's oldest son, Zachary, helped him serve lemonade. Even though only a few more neighbors showed up, the gathering felt cozy and happy. Mrs. Hawkins smiled and spoke loudly. "Gabriel, your boys are delightful. Zachary here has wonderful manners, and Aiden was just telling me about how much he loves science." Gabriel saw how Aiden's face brightened at the compliment. Outside, Eli and the Zacharias kids were laughing and having fun playing basketball. Mr. Zacharias took another sandwich and said, "We should do this more often. My kids need new friends in the neighborhood." Gabriel's boys shared small smiles, feeling relaxed for the first time since moving in. They were finally starting to feel comfortable and welcome. As the day went on, Gabriel watched his boys getting along with everyone. Eli taught the Zacharias kids some basketball tricks. Aiden chatted about his favorite books with Mrs. Hawkins, and Zachary showed off his toy cars to anyone who wanted to see them. Even though the turnout was smaller than Gabriel had hoped, the warmth of the people who did come meant everything to him. He could see his boys standing a little taller, feeling more confident. The following Sunday morning, Gabriel and the boys were fixing their ties in front of the mirror. They'd been invited to the church picnic and decided to go. "Looking sharp," Gabriel said as he straightened Eli's collar. The boys were quieter than usual, a little nervous. When they arrived at the church, the smell of barbecue filled the air, and tables covered with homemade dishes were set up on the lawn. Some people from their neighborhood gathering were there too. The Zacharias family waved, and Mrs. Hawkins called them over to sit with her. "I'm glad you boys could make it," she said, patting the empty seats beside her. "Have you tried the potato salad? It's my grandmother's recipe." The picnic felt lighter and more fun than Gabriel had expected. Some kids invited Zachary to join their game of tag, and Eli found himself talking about basketball with other teens from school. But then Mr. Peters, one of the church elders, came to their table. He looked at Gabriel's family with a face that seemed both polite and disapproving. "Well, isn't this different?" Mr. Peters said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, Gabriel, when my wife and I adopted, we chose children who fit in with our family values." The words made everyone go quiet. Gabriel felt his jaw tighten, seeing the light fade in his son's eyes. Aiden slouched and Eli stopped talking to the teens. "My sons fit perfectly with my family values, Mr. Peters," Gabriel replied firmly. "Love, respect, and kindness are what matter most to us." But the damage was done. The comfort they'd been feeling disappeared. Zachary came running back from his game, sensing the tension, and stayed close to Gabriel's side. The boys stopped eating and no longer wanted to socialize. On the drive home, Gabriel gripped the steering wheel, feeling frustrated. They'd been making progress, and the boys were starting to feel happy in the community. But one unkind comment had taken that happiness away. From the back seat, Aiden spoke up quietly. "Dad, can we have our own picnic next Sunday?" "Just us." Gabriel looked at his son in the rearview mirror, seeing both the hurt and trust in his eyes, trust that Gabriel would protect them. "Of course we can, buddy," Gabriel replied, his heart heavy but determined to make things better for his sons. In the evenings, Gabriel spent time teaching the boys practical skills. Tonight, he and Eli were in their little workshop, working on a birdhouse. Gabriel guided Eli as he carefully sanded the wood. "Remember, slow and steady," Gabriel said gently. "Feel the wood. It'll tell you when it's smooth enough." Eli focused hard, his tongue sticking out a little as he concentrated. "Dad," Eli said, holding up the wood to show Gabriel, "is this good?" Hearing Eli call him Dad made Gabriel's heart feel full. It still felt new and precious. "That's perfect, son," Gabriel said with a proud smile. "You have a natural touch for this." They worked together, Gabriel showing Eli how to apply the last coat of sealant. When the birdhouse was finished, Eli's eyes sparkled with pride as they carried it to the yard. "Where should we hang it?" Gabriel asked, holding the ladder steady. Eli pointed to a branch on the old maple tree. "Right there, so we can see it from the Kitlin window," he said. After securing the birdhouse, Aiden and Zachary came running over, amazed by Eli's work. "You built that?" Zachary asked in awe. Eli nodded, standing a little taller. "Dad taught me how." "It's beautiful," Gabriel said, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You should be proud of yourself." Tears filled Eli's eyes, surprising Gabriel. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked gently. Eli wiped his eyes. "No one ever told me I could make something good before," he whispered. Gabriel pulled Eli into a tight hug, feeling his son's arms wrap around him. Aiden and Zachary joined, creating a family hug that said more than words ever could. Later that evening, Gabriel and Eli watched from the Kitlin window as a pair of birds investigated Eli's birdhouse. Eli's face glowed with happiness as he watched the birds make their new home. 10 years passed, and Gabriel could hardly believe the men his boys had become. Eli, now a skilled carpenter with his own business, stood beside Gabriel at the community center, organizing boxes of food. Aiden, who had become a teacher at the local school, was helping older people carry their donations. Zachary, the youngest, was now a nurse and was carefully sorting medical supplies. "Mr. Henderson!" Mrs. Hawkins called out, her wrinkled face smiling as she walked over. "Your boys are such a blessing to this community. Aiden taught my grandson last year, and he's never loved school more." Gabriel's heart swelled with pride. "Thank you, Martha," he replied. "They've grown into fine men." Across the room, Eli was teaching a young volunteer how to stack boxes safely, but with the same patience Gabriel had once shown him. Aiden's joyful laugh filled the hall as he chatted with former students, and Zachary organized the medical supplies with the care he showed his patients. "Hey, Dad," Eli called. needing more boxes in the sorting area. Gabriel walked to the storage room, passing a few neighbors. Though most smiled warmly, he noticed Mr. Parker and his wife giving their usual disapproving looks. Some things hadn't changed even after 10 years, but Gabriel barely felt bothered anymore. His sons had proven themselves over and over, their kindness and hard work showing everyone who they truly were. "Your family has been such a gift," said Susan Miller, the event coordinator, as she helped Gabriel carry more boxes. "We wouldn't be able to help so many families without your boys. They're here every month, without fail." Gabriel watched his sons working together, their easy laughter and willingness to help touching his heart. They had grown from shy, unsure boys into confident, caring men who made him proud every single day. Yet, even now, he noticed Mr. Parker steering his grandchildren away when Aiden came near. In their small town, some people took a long time to change, but Gabriel had learned to focus on the positive. The warm smiles and sincere thank yous were far more important than the occasional cold look. "Hey, Dad," Zachary called, carrying an armful of supplies and joining Gabriel. "Remember when we used to be scared to come to these events?" Gabriel nodded, thinking back to those early days of uncertainty. He smiled proudly, watching his sons, knowing how far they'd come. One evening, Gabriel quietly watched his sons working hard and confidently. He saw how they made a real difference in others' lives. But the next week, dark clouds gathered, and the sky looked angry. Gabriel and his sons rushed to prepare their home for the big storm. The wind was so strong it bent trees, and rain hit the windows hard. Gabriel shouted, "Get the emergency supplies from the basement." Eli and Aiden ran downstairs while Zachary helped Gabriel cover the windows. The typhoon, a powerful storm, was here. The family huddled together in the basement as the storm roared outside. The walls creaked and groaned under the weight of the wind. Gabriel held his sons close, just like he used to during thunderstorms when they were little. Suddenly, they heard a terrible cracking sound, and water started leaking through the ceiling. "We need to get out," Gabriel shouted, grabbing their emergency bags. They ran upstairs and saw part of their roof had collapsed. Rain poured inside, and they knew they had to leave. They got to their truck just as more of their roof caved in. As they drove to the community center, which was the emergency shelter, Gabriel drove carefully. Trees and power lines had fallen everywhere, and the streets they knew so well were now like rushing rivers. When they arrived at the shelter, many families were already there, sitting on chairs and blankets. Gabriel noticed that people who normally kept to themselves were now sitting close together, sharing their stories and worries. Mrs. Parker, who usually didn't talk to others, sat nearby, shivering as she told them how her roof had blown away. Someone else said, "The whole north side of town is flooded." Gabriel listened to the stories of loss, but he felt proud as he watched his sons. Zachary helped elderly people with their medicines. Aiden kept the little kids busy so they wouldn't be scared. And Eli worked with other strong men to bring in supplies and set up chairs. Their own home was badly damaged, maybe beyond repair, but Gabriel felt peace watching his sons care for their neighbors. The storm had broken down the walls that kept people apart. Now they were all just humans helping each other. All night, more people arrived, wet and frightened. Gabriel and his sons handed out blankets, hot coffee, and comfort to everyone. In this shelter, there was no room for old grudges. Someone said, "We lost almost everything, but at least we're alive." Gabriel looked around and agreed. The storm had taken their homes and belongings, but had also washed away the things that kept people from being friends. When morning came, Gabriel and his sons went back to their house, feeling nervous. But they were lucky. While the roof was damaged and the yard messy, the house had held up because Gabriel had taken such good care of it. "Thank goodness," Gabriel said, touching the strong walls he had fixed just last summer. "Boys, get your gloves. There are people who need our help." They loaded their truck with tools and supplies and headed out. Gabriel's years of working in construction would now be very helpful. As they drove through the neighborhood, they saw all the destruction. Trees were down, roofs were broken, and power lines hung dangerously. At their first stop, they went to the Zacharias family's home. Gabriel started fixing their roof, while Eli handed him tools. Aiden and Zachary handed out water bottles and meals. But not everyone wanted help. Mrs. Watson, whose house was badly damaged, scowled when the boys offered her water and food. "We're neighbors, ma'am," Aiden said gently, even though she looked unhappy. Further down the street, Gabriel offered to help Mr. Campbell with his broken fence. The old man didn't want to accept help, even though his fence looked ready to fall. But for every person who refused, others were grateful. The Thompsons let Gabriel fix their broken windows, and Mrs. Rodriguez hugged the boys when they helped clear a fallen tree from her driveway. All day, Gabriel and his sons worked hard. They fixed roofs, cleared away debris, and made sure houses were safe. The boys learned about construction, but they also learned about kindness and helping others, even when it wasn't easy. At one point, Zachary said, "Dad, why do some people still don't want our help?" Gabriel replied, "Sometimes hearts are harder to fix than homes, son, but we help anyway because it's the right thing to do." As they moved through the town, people began to warm up. Mrs. Lynn, who used to rush her grandkids inside whenever Gabriel's family walked by, watched with wide eyes as Eli and Aiden carefully cleared branches from her garden without disturbing her roses. "Would you like some lemonade?" she called out shyly, and the boys accepted with smiles. Later, on the Rodriguez family's roof, Gabriel showed Eli how to seal a leak properly. "See how the water moves? We start from the bottom and go up," Gabriel explained. Eli listened closely and helped his dad. Down below, Mr. Rodriguez watched them, his face softening. He had once been against Gabriel adopting his sons, but now he could see how close they were and how well they worked together. "Your boy has a good head for this," he said to Gabriel. "All my boys do," Gabriel replied with pride. The more they worked, the more neighbors began to change their minds. Zachary's gentle way with a frightened cat made Mrs. Patterson, who once ignored them, smile. Aiden stopped water from flooding the Miller family's basement, and they thanked him, even though they used to avoid his family. By the afternoon, even neighbors who hadn't wanted help before were now asking for it. The Watson children, who had never been allowed to play with Gabriel's boys, joined in to clear debris from the playground. At one point, Mr. Thompson, a neighbor, said to Gabriel, "You've taught them well. Those are good kids you're raising." Gabriel looked at his sons with pride. Eli was organizing a line of people passing sandbags, Aiden was comforting a crying toddler, and Zachary was sharing his water bottle with an elderly neighbor. Gabriel's heart swelled as he realized that his boys were changing people's hearts with their kindness and hard work. Toward the end of the day, they came to Mrs. Ellis's house. Her garden was ruined, and her porch had partly collapsed. Mrs. Ellis had once said terrible things about Gabriel adopting the boys, and her words had spread doubt in the community. But now she looked at them with sadness and worry. "I could use some help," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Without a word, the boys got to work. Eli checked the porch's damage, and Aiden and Zachary started clearing branches from her garden, taking special care with her roses. Mrs. Ellis watched as Gabriel guided his sons with patience and love, as they worked together as a family. Tears filled her eyes when she saw Zachary carefully pick up one of her garden gnomes, which he placed safely on her porch. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Ellis suddenly said, her voice trembling. "The things I said, the way I treated you." She paused, wiping her eyes. "You're showing more kindness now than I ever did. Your boys are a blessing to this community, and you're the father they deserve." She turned to the boys. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Gabriel's sons were surprised to hear her say this, and they stood a little straighter. Gabriel felt proud of his boys and the strength they'd shown. Together, they had shown the whole town that love and kindness could change even the most stubborn hearts. Gabriel and his three sons, Aiden, Eli, and Zachary, were working hard to help the people in their town after a big storm had caused a lot of damage. They cleaned up broken tree branches, fixed roofs, and picked up pieces of things that had been thrown around by the strong winds. At first, it was hard for Gabriel and his sons because many people in the town had not been friendly to them. They treated them like they didn't belong. But Gabriel didn't let this stop him. He was determined to show everyone that they were there to help and be part of the community. One sunny afternoon, after a long day of cleaning, Mrs. Ellis, an elderly woman in the neighborhood, invited Gabriel and the boys over for lemonade and cookies. She had once been one of the people who seemed unsure about Gabriel and his boys, but that day she was smiling. She had set up a little table on her porch with glasses of cold lemonade and a plate of cookies. The boys sat down a bit stiffly at first, not sure how to act, but as Mrs. Ellis began to talk and share stories about the history of the town, they slowly started to relax. She treated them with warmth and kindness, just like other kids in the neighborhood. As they were walking back home after their visit with Mrs. Ellis, Eli looked up at his dad with wonder in his eyes and said, "Dad, did you see? She looked at us like we were just normal kids." Gabriel's heart swelled with pride and a bit of relief. He knew how much it meant to his sons to feel accepted and loved. It gave him hope that the people in the town were starting to see his family differently, that they were finally seeing them as a true part of the neighborhood. The very next day, Gabriel and his sons went to help Mrs. Hawkins, another older woman in the town whose roof had been badly damaged by the storm. Mrs. Hawkins had always been polite, but Gabriel remembered that when they first moved into town, she seemed a bit unsure about his family. Even though she had always greeted them with a smile, there had been a look of uncertainty in her eyes. But Gabriel didn't hold that against her and was happy to help her now when she needed it. As Gabriel was up on a ladder fixing the shingles on Mrs. Hawkins's roof, she called him down softly, asking if he could come over for a moment. She sounded like she had something serious to say. Gabriel climbed down from the ladder, wiping the sweat from his brow. His boys came closer too, sensing that something important was about to happen. With a shaky voice, Mrs. Hawkins began to tell Gabriel and his boys how she had once doubted Gabriel's choice to adopt them. She said, "When I first heard you were adopting these boys, I had my doubts. I was raised in a different time, and I didn't understand." She looked down, ashamed, as she continued. "But watching you all these months, seeing the beautiful family you have become, I see now how wrong I was. These boys are a gift to our town, and you are the finest father I have ever seen." Gabriel's throat tightened with emotion as he looked at his sons, who stood a little taller, looking proud and deeply moved by Mrs. Hawkins's words. She reached out and took Gabriel's hand, squeezing it gently as tears filled her eyes. One by one, neighbors who had once been unfriendly began to warm up to Gabriel and his family. Some of the people who had avoided them now stopped by to offer a friendly wave or a smile, and some of the children who used to ignore Gabriel's boys began to show interest in playing with them. It was like a little bit of magic was working its way through the town, one kind word at a time. One day, while Gabriel and his sons were cleaning up more debris from the storm, a group of boys from school walked up. These boys had once been mean to Aiden, Gabriel's eldest son, teasing him and calling him names. At the front of the group was Jackson, the leader. Jackson looked at the ground, shuffling his feet as if he were unsure of what to say. Finally, he spoke up, saying, We came to help if that's okay." Gabriel watched Aiden's face closely, knowing how much those boys' teasing had hurt him. Aiden seemed tense, his shoulders stiff, but before he could respond, other neighbors began showing up to help with tools, supplies, and warm smiles. After a moment, Jackson looked up at Aiden and said, "I'm really sorry for how I treated you. We were wrong, and seeing you and your family helping everyone, even people who weren't nice to you, I don't know. I guess it made me think." The other boys nodded, their faces serious. Gabriel felt proud of his son as Aiden looked at him, and Gabriel gave him an encouraging nod. Aiden looked back at Jackson and with a soft voice said, "Yeah, we can work together." As the day went on, the boys worked side by side, sharing tools and even joking around. Aiden, Eli, and Zachary laughed with the boys who had once been their bullies, and Gabriel saw that something important had changed. The people who used to be unkind were now becoming friends. It felt like a new beginning for Gabriel's family. The days passed, and Gabriel's family continued helping neighbors. One day, they went out to look at their own house, which had been badly damaged in the storm. The roof had holes where branches had fallen through, and water stains covered the walls. It looked like it would be a lot of work to fix, but Gabriel told his boys with a smile, "We'll fix it up, boys." Before they could even start, though, they heard the rumble of trucks. To their surprise, a line of trucks pulled up outside their house, all filled with building materials and people who were ready to help. Mrs. Hawkins stepped out of one of the trucks with her son, and Jackson's parents came with tools. Mr. Lynn, who owned the hardware store, brought shingles and nails, and even Mr. Marshall, a builder who once avoided Gabriel, offered to fix the roof. All these people, who had once kept their distance, now showed up to help. The neighbors worked together fixing the roof, repainting the walls, and cleaning up the yard. They brought new curtains, fresh paint, and even made sandwiches and lemonade to share with everyone. The boys watched in amazement as people who had once seemed distant now laughed with them and treated them like family. By the end of the day, their house was fixed, but something even more important had happened. They were part of the community now. A few weeks later, the mayor invited Gabriel and his family to speak at a town meeting. Gabriel's sons were nervous, but they felt it was important to share their story. The community center was packed with people who had helped during the storm, and familiar faces filled the seats. Aiden, being the oldest, spoke first. His voice was a little shaky, but it grew stronger as he went on. "Years ago, we lost everything, but then we found something we never expected. A dad who chose us and who fights for us every day." Eli was next. His eyes found Mrs. Hawkins in the crowd as he said, "When we first came here, people looked at us like we were different, but Dad taught us that love doesn't see color. He showed us how to be strong when people were unkind." Finally, Zachary, the youngest, said simply, "Our dad never gave up on us, and he never gave up on this town either." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. People remembered how Gabriel and his sons had helped without asking for anything in return, and many felt inspired. After the meeting, people in the town began talking more openly about being kinder and more welcoming. The local newspaper wrote a story about Gabriel and his family, and soon people were inviting them over for dinner and greeting them warmly at the grocery store. They even asked the family to help plan the next town festival, wanting it to be a celebration that welcomed everyone. As the days went on, Gabriel's sons became role models in the town. They spoke at school about kindness and forgiveness, and other kids listened to them, inspired by how they had turned unkindness into friendship. People from nearby towns heard about their story, and it inspired them too, encouraging everyone to be more open-hearted. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, Mrs. Ellis came to Gabriel's front door. She looked a bit nervous, fidgeting with her purse, but Gabriel welcomed her with a warm smile. She looked up at him, then down at her hands, before saying softly, "I wanted to say thank you. You and your boys have brought something special to our town." Gabriel felt his heart fill with gratitude. He was proud of his boys and grateful for the kindness that had blossomed around them. Gabriel and his sons had shown the town that love and kindness could bring people together, no matter how different they seemed. The house was mended, but more importantly, so were the hearts of the people in the town. Gabriel's boys felt truly at home, surrounded by friends, kindness, and acceptance. It was a community built not just with wood and nails, but with trust and understanding, and that was something that would last forever. The boys stopped playing their board game and looked up when Mrs. Ellis came into the living room. She spoke in a voice softer than they had ever heard before. "I wonder if I could talk to you and the boys," she said. Gabriel paused for a moment, but then nodded, moving aside to let her in. The boys sat up straight, looking at her cautiously, remembering how she had often been stern and disapproving. Mrs. Ellis took a deep breath and started talking, her usual tough face softening as she wiped away a tear. "I've been thinking a lot about how I treated you all," she said, her voice shaking. "I said and did some things I regret. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." The boys exchanged surprised looks. They had never seen Mrs. Ellis like this before, so emotional. Gabriel stood quietly, his hand on Zachary's shoulder, watching her. "When the typhoon hit," she continued, "I saw how hard you all worked to help everyone, even the people who had been mean to you. I saw the love in your family. I saw how strong you are together. And I realized how wrong I was to judge you. Your family is beautiful." Eli's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Ellis looked at each of the boys and said, "I'm sorry for the things I said and did that hurt you. You didn't deserve that. You should have been welcomed here." Gabriel's heart warmed from hearing her words. Aidan, who had always gotten the hardest words from her, spoke up. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. That means a lot to us." Mrs. Ellis smiled a little. "Your father has raised you to be wonderful young men. I hope you can forgive me for being wrong." The boys looked at Gabriel, who nodded at them. Then Zachary, the youngest, stepped forward and gave Mrs. Ellis a hug. She froze for a second, but then her shoulders shook as she cried. The boys joined in, one by one, giving her a hug. "We forgive you," Eli said simply. Gabriel gave her one last hug, too. Mrs. Ellis whispered, "Thank you for showing this town what real strength looks like, what a real family looks like." Later, in the town square, everyone was getting ready for a big celebration. The square was full of lights and tables covered with food. Gabriel and his boys sat in the front row, a little uncomfortable because everyone was looking at them. Mayor Grant stepped up to the microphone and said, "Tonight we're here to celebrate not just fixing our town, but fixing our hearts. This family showed us what community really means. After all the bad things that happened, they stepped up to help everyone. They never asked for anything in return, not even from the people who had been mean to them." Other neighbors shared their stories too. Mr. Campbell, who owned the hardware store, talked about how the boys helped organize a group of teenagers to deliver supplies to elderly people. Mrs. Zacharias talked about how Gabriel and Eli helped fix her porch when she couldn't afford the repairs. Mrs. Ellis spoke last, saying, "These four people taught us that family is about love and sticking together, even when times are tough." The boys sat up straighter as they heard these kind words. At first, they had felt uncomfortable, but now they felt proud. Gabriel's eyes shone with pride as he watched his sons. He squeezed Eli's shoulder, feeling so happy. The mayor called Gabriel and the boys up to the stage to give them a plaque. "This will hang in our town hall as a reminder of the lessons you taught us," the mayor said. The crowd stood and clapped, some people even wiping away tears. Gabriel stood with his arms around his boys, his family looking strong and proud. They were no longer seen with whispers and judgment, but with respect and admiration. Gabriel stepped up to the microphone, holding it tightly for a moment as he looked at the crowd. His voice shook with emotion. "I never wanted to change anyone's mind," he said. "I just wanted to give three amazing boys a home and love. When I first brought Eli, Aiden, and Zachary home, I knew we'd face some challenges. But these boys, they showed me what real strength is. They faced every unkind word with dignity. They taught me more about courage than I could ever teach them. Gabriel paused, wiping his eyes. And now, standing here today, I see what family truly means. It's not about looking the same or being related by blood. It's about hearts that love each other. The crowd was silent, listening carefully. Gabriel pointed to the rebuilt town around them. The storm that hit was bad, but it washed away more than just buildings. It washed away fear and prejudice. Now we stand together, not as different families, but as one community. My boys and I aren't just fixing houses, we're building bridges between hearts. Eli, Aiden, and Zachary moved closer to Gabriel, forming a tight circle. "Thank you," Gabriel said, his voice trembling. "Thank you for opening your hearts to us, for letting us show you that love has no boundaries. And thank you to my boys for making me the proudest father any man could ask for." The crowd began to cry, moved by Gabriel's words. Mrs. Hawkins wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Campbell took off his glasses and wiped his tears. Mrs. Ellis had tears running down her face, too. This journey has taught us that the strongest foundations aren't built with wood and nails, but with acceptance, understanding, and love. And those foundations can survive any storm, Gabriel finished. 10 years later, Gabriel drove back into town with his 3 grown sons following behind him. The town looked different, but the spirit of community was still there. There were banners celebrating the 10th anniversary of the rebuild, and the same people who had once looked at Gabriel's family with judgment now smiled and waved. Eli, now in charge of Gabriel's contracting business, Aiden, a respected pediatrician, and Zachary, a teacher, joined Gabriel in the crowd. Mrs. Hawkins, older now, gave them all a big hug. "Look at how handsome you boys have become," she said with a smile. More people gathered around them, sharing happy memories. Mr. Campbell even laughed and said, "Remember when we all thought Gabriel was crazy? Turns out he was the wisest man in town." Gabriel watched his sons talking to everyone. He was proud of them and the way they had grown. The town, once full of whispers, now celebrated them as their own. Mrs. Ellis appeared beside Gabriel, her voice soft with emotion. "These boys of yours have made us all better people," she said, giving Gabriel's arm a gentle squeeze. "And you've shown us what real fatherhood looks like." Gabriel watched his sons talking to their old teachers, shaking hands and helping people. The love that had once seemed strange to the town now felt as natural as the river running through it. Gabriel's family had helped rebuild not just houses, but hearts. They had changed the town forever. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.